Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events. In international relations, the visits of high-level dignitaries are very important. They are important because they allow an opportunity for top leaders to know each other personally, discover if they have a matching chemistry, and then, of course, if the contexts are warm enough, they facilitate negotiations. It's nobody's argument that such personal friendship can override national interest, a basic coincidence or conflict, but these things help. And also, when we see these high-level summit meetings, it is not as if only 2 or 3 leaders are meeting personally. Groundwork is done for a long number of weeks. The adequate preparation is there, an agenda is prepared. And unfortunately, all this activity, this high-level diplomatic activity, had been interrupted due to COVID pandemic. And after the relaxation from the fear of COVID, now these diplomatic activities are being resumed. First, there was a flurry, a surge of high-level visitors to India, and now Prime Minister Modi has once again resumed his trips abroad. The most recent example was his hectic 2-day, 3-country visit. But some people who like to criticize the Prime Minister said that what is the point of having these whirlwind tours? They fail to realize that these may have been 2-day visits or 3-night visits, but they cover a lot of countries which are in news at the moment, which are likely to be in news in near future, and they allow the Prime Minister to renew and check firsthand what India's interests are, how they are going to be affected in these countries. Take, for instance, Germany, where a new chancellor has assumed power, and Scholz and his foreign minister, who's a Green Party committed member, have a very different point of view on how to cope with the Russian gas crisis or how to deal with the climate change. They're very different from what other members of the EU have. Then when Indian Prime Minister went to the Nordic countries, he also not presided over, but participated enthusiastically, was received warmly over a Nordic summit. Now, this Nordic summit is interesting. It allows him not only to touch one base in the country called Denmark, but all the other Nordic countries come there. So he had an opportunity of meeting the prime ministers of Iceland, Sweden, Finland, besides Denmark, Norway. So this is an extremely interesting thing that he was trying to explore areas of Europe which are normally neglected. We shall come to that in a minute. Also, there have been developments. We might as well look what all are the visits which are going to be in near future. He might participate in BRICS meetings, he might participate in the G4 meetings, he might participate in other bilateral meetings, and he might undertake visits to UAE. He is likely to visit Nepal in near future. So all this diplomatic activity, which has been confined to virtual meetings, is again becoming interpersonal diplomacy, and let's see how it turns out. There are other developments taking place in other parts of the world. The crisis, for instance, in Sri Lanka, the economic crisis is taking a very, very grave turn towards a major political crisis. The country seems to be perched very precariously on the brink of anarchy. We'll have to discuss that as well. We will also have to take a quick look at what has been happening in the local body elections in United Kingdom, where the Sinn Féin has emerged victorious in Northern Ireland, where Scotland vote has been against the Conservative Party. The Conservatives have lost a lot of important strongholds in homeland itself. And all this is happening at a time when Boris Johnson, who was beleaguered about his various allegations of misconduct, had got a brief respite, but he will again have to face the time of reckoning as this happens. We have all this, and we might as well have a look at what is happening in China next door, because China, despite the COVID, had registered claimed to register a very high rate of economic growth, not high in comparison to its own high rates of growth, but comparison to other recovering economies in other parts of the world. But then again, China has been beset with another wave of COVID, and China's policy of zero COVID tolerance is interfering with this economic development. So it is a big question mark whether China would be able to maintain its economic recovery at this fast rate, and what is going to happen to Chinese economy. The sectors of manufacturing, the sectors of infrastructure building, again, are there. So we'll have a look at all this and more this time. what we must appreciate is that Prime Minister Modi was just not trying to do a whistle-stop whirlwind tour of 3 countries in 2 days in Europe. What he was trying to do is to refocus on Europe in its entirety, and also trying to fathom out that how in the post-COVID world, how in the post-Russian intervention in Ukraine world, India's national interests in this region are affected. Often enough, analysts in international relations have said that the war in Ukraine is a European war. It doesn't impinge on India's essential national interest, at least immediately, and India should be more concerned about whatever is happening in its neighborhood. And truth be told, much is happening in India's neighborhood which should cause us concern, whether it is developments in Sri Lanka, or whether it is in China, whether it is in next door Pakistan and Afghanistan, or whether the likelihood of instability and economic default in Nepal. Now, all these things concern India immediately. But it would be very naive to believe that whatever is happening in Europe is not likely to have a spillover effect on us. First of all, there is pressure on India to come out as the largest democracy in the world in favor of democracies of the West and criticize Russia. Now, the visit to Germany was particularly focused on this issue, that Germany is one country in the European Union, is so dependent almost of 40% for its energy requirements on Russian gas and petrol, that they were reluctant to impose sanctions on Russia or more sanctions on Russia immediately. As long as the sanctions concerned coal, it was welcome because Germany is not dependent on coal. But when it comes to gas, Germany sort of bit the bullet and postponed the inauguration of the Nord 2 stream, but it is reluctant to have more sanctions because it thinks it might affect on its economy. So the Indians wanted to convince the Germans that like they are dependent on gas for Russia, India is dependent to a large extent on its military hardware on Russia, technology transfer, and it will take time before it can redirect, before it can have alternative channels of fulfilling these requirements. And this is, of course, not to understate that India has had a very special relationship with Russia ever since independence in terms of technology transfers, not only military technology, and in terms of Russian support in the Security Council. So this was one part. The other thing was the Germans have also, during the former Chancellor Angela Merkel's time, following a policy of open arms to refugees, which has not gone down very well with other members in the European Union. And Indians also have this problem that when they welcomed at the time of 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, millions of refugees. They had earlier accepted millions of Tibetan refugees, but now they are under pressure constantly that if you have an open border, you might have an influx of refugees, which put an unacceptable burden not only on your economy, but expose your security to the vulnerable threat of international terrorism, flesh trade, contraband trade in arms, psychotropic narcotic drugs, etc. Now, this is something which Germany's new regime is also facing, and there also, unfortunately, is a revival of racist neo-Nazi resistance to immigrants who belong to a different religion, who have a different race, who have different language, and they are aliens. So this coexistence of refugees has been underlined by the war in Ukraine, where almost all European countries have welcomed with open arms the refugees from Ukraine. Now, who racially are closer to them, who religiously are closer to them, who broadly share the same cultural ethic. So this double standards about refugees is also creating a problem. And the kind of Islamophobia which is been emerging in some countries in Europe, parts of Germany, is of concern. So whenever India is exposed to the charges or exposed to allegations of not being democratic, not accepting dissent, also curtailing human rights, curtailing freedom of expression, I think it allows an opportunity very politely to hold a mirror to the host and tell them that, look, we are all facing the same problem, whether it is terrorism, or whether it is climate change. Now, of course, Mr. Modi is expected to play a very, very important role in climate change diplomacy in Quads, and he has always spoken very forcefully ever since COP26 Even in Paris summit, he had been very vocal about this before it was derailed by ex-President Trump. So I think both in the context of energy security, in terms of climate diplomacy, and in context of refugees and curtailment of democratic rights, and also how to cope best with international terrorism, the visit to Germany was important. Now, Germany is a source for important technology. There is a very interesting interaction between Indian and German trade of commerce and industries. There are possibilities of extending areas of cooperation in all these fields. So this was just to revive the lost context during COVID, and then he moved on to Denmark. And Denmark, I think, is underestimated by most people. It was not just a visit to Denmark. It was a visit to Denmark where the second Nordic summit was held. And the first Nordic summit was held in 2018. Had COVID not interfered, India would have probably gained greater momentum with the Nordic summits. Maybe one Nordic summit every year would have taken place. Now, this is important to believe that this kind of a summit, the Nordic countries only have with India, or they have an interaction of this kind with the United States of America. So this is a very, very special position which India has carved out for itself in the Nordic countries. Now, whenever we in India think of Europe, we think of France, we think of Germany, maybe we think of Italy, we think of Belgium, we think of Spain, we think of Portugal, countries with which India has either had ties, historic ties, or post-independence, we have had an interaction with in terms of technology, in terms of education, science, etc. We normally tend to forget countries in Europe, which we had some kind of a relationship with East European countries, but it was mediated through the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics during the time of USSR, and even later, after the breakdown of the USSR. Even when these countries, some of them became members of the EU, they were treated differently as countries with which India had friendly, fraternal ties during the socialist regime. Now, interestingly, the countries in the Northern Europe are left out. And these are very special countries because these countries enjoy some of the, if not the highest standards of living in the world anywhere. They are all social welfare states, and people pay high taxes, but they have excellent medical care, they have longevity, the longest life expectancy in the world, to the extent, and they have very good technological expertise in certain areas, not necessarily in military hardware, but in telecommunications, in electronics, and also in marine technology, in maintaining marine ecosystems, also exploration of the Arctic region, which is next door for them. Now, when you look at these countries, the Indians share a very special interest with them. These countries have great expertise in what is called blue economy, which is the ocean-based marine ecosystems. And Indians believe, the Indian Prime Minister has been visionary in this, to say that India, because it is a coastline, it opens out to Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, also has an interest in blue economy. And it is the oceans where not only the mineral resources, but they can meet the food security problems of the rest of the world through fisheries and so on. China has been taking a very aggressive role in developing its naval prowess and also trying to exploit the marine resources. So these countries who depend primarily on marine resources for food and mineral resources are there. They also are countries which are most likely to be affected by cataclysmic change in the climate. Now, if the temperature goes up beyond 1.5 degrees since the industrial age, the meltdown effect will be first felt by these countries. The climate will change, the way of life they have will be destroyed. With a very brief period of nice warm summer, everything they know would be destroyed. So they are the ones which are faced with this challenge, and India has a very close coincidence of interest, overlapping interest with these countries in terms of development of blue economy, in terms of constructive resources for climate change, how to cope with it, how to have renewable green energy resources, and also technology. And also the technology in telecom or anywhere else, or even submarine explorations or research explorations in Arctic region. We have mentioned in past that the Arctic region is going to increase in strategic importance in near future. Russians have undertaken some under the ice explorations there. One of their nuclear subs was sunk there long years ago. Chinese are on the fringes from the other side of the frozen Vladivostok side where the Chinese border touches the Siberian border, have been doing it. Canadians are proximate, but difficult to imagine they can do something entirely on their own unless the Americans are there. The ex-President Trump had once made an offer to Denmark to buy Greenland from it. because it would have given them a foothold to the Arctic region. But Indians have no such ambitions to make a military outpost there. But the areas of collaboration in terms of medical research, scientific research, telecoms, education, and earlier there was a barrier of language, but now a lot of these linguistic barriers have been broken down. One more thing which is very important here is the Finland's parliament, its defense committee, has recently passed a resolution that it may consider joining the NATO. Now, this is a direct spillover of the war in Ukraine. What happened to Ukraine, because Ukraine was not allowed a membership of NATO, the Russians could violate Ukrainian sovereignty in a special military operation they call, which is undeclared war for all, which is almost completing 3 months now, has devastated the country. Had Ukraine been a member of NATO, it would have had the ironclad protection of the other NATOs coming together. Now, this is open to question whether despite that, the NATO leadership or the Americans would have decided to take on a nuclear Russia, bring it to the brink of a nuclear war between the two superpowers, had Ukraine been a member of NATO. But that is a hypothetical question. Scared by this, Finland has always followed a policy of voluntary neutrality. It has decided to be neutral through, and it has been called Finlandization. The policy of Finlandization means if a country is forced to accept a policy of neutrality, it is very different from non-alignment. Non-alignment is deciding your course of action independently, strategically, autonomously, in light of your own national interests. But neutrality means that you don't have a choice. You are emasculated in a sense to say that you will remain neutral regardless of what the conflict would be. Now, this Finlandization would be, the clock would be turned back if Finland joins NATO. And there is the same kind of a debate which is taking place in Sweden, which has remained outside military pacts so far throughout the Cold War. Switzerland, Sweden, Finland. But in the Nordic countries, if you see, if the Nordic countries decide to seek cover of the NATO protection, this is going to have two effects. A, this is certainly going to be considered provocative by Russia, because they would say that if Finland joins NATO, again the NATO forces would be bang on the border where St. Petersburg is, the Russian border is there. So would Russians accept that? Would Russians keep quiet about that? Or would this protection, would this membership give effective protection to these Nordic countries, is something which we have to watch. So this is the reason why the Prime Minister's visit to the Nordic countries and the Nordic Summit, second Nordic Summit, should be considered very important, because here in this part of the world, great strategic changes are taking place, and possibility for India's cooperation and collaboration with these countries is increasing, which increases its options in Europe. Then the Indian Prime Minister went to France. Some people are disappointed that much talked about submarine deal did not take place, but that is a very complex issue, because India is also trying to go along a path of Atmanirbharta, self-reliance, interdependence, and part of that project is that any technology which is transferred from a foreign country would have to be accessible to an Indian company, which may be in the private sector. And many companies in the West would be reluctant, not only in France, but in America and Germany or UK, to have this kind of an agreement. It would take a lot of time to have these creases ironed out, but sooner rather than later, the Indian and French military collaboration might also fructify. So it was just to keep the momentum going, and it should not be underestimated that the Indian Prime Minister was the first foreign dignitary to be welcomed by Macron after he was re-elected. And the French have always supported Indian bid for the membership as a permanent membership in the Security Council. Not only that, in the whole ASPAC region, although after AUKUS has superseded Quads, the strategic significance of Quads is not so important, but France's physical presence in New Caledonia and in the Indo-Pacific region allows India and France to share a perspective how to push back against the Chinese thrust in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. So this was the context in which Mr. Modi's visit to Europe should be evaluated. And I think the sober assessment of this would be that it was not a sort of optical photo op visit. It was to pick up the momentum, to regain the momentum lost during the COVID, and to have a perspective on Europe, which takes into account the war in Ukraine, the climate change, and also what are the fissures or dissensions within the European Union, and how the European Union might be stalemated, might be stuck because of there no unanimity or consensus among its members about various things. So it is perhaps better to concentrate or select countries and groups of countries. Barely had the Indian Prime Minister returned home that a crisis awaited him in the immediate neighborhood. And this was in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has been tottering on the verge of economic failure, bankruptcy for quite some time. And Indians have tried to do their best to help out the nation next door by giving them $1 billion of foreign exchange to get over, tide over, immediately purchase fuel, medicines, food, etc. Given an extended credit line of 1.5 billion and had promised more. It had come out with a ship laden with fuel there, food stuff there. But unfortunately, the Sri Lankan government had landed itself in such a mess, partly due to the bankruptcy it had brought upon itself by spending money recklessly ever since the Rajapaksa government took over power, by borrowing from China, becoming an enthusiastic member of the One Belt, One Road scheme, leasing out land near Hambantota port to the Chinese, offering them a base there. They thought that they would spend money on infrastructure. This would generate employment, this would generate foreign exchange, but nothing happened. First of all, a lot of money was allegedly siphoned off as corruption, as kickbacks, and so on. Hambantota was a pocket borough of the Rajapaksa family. It did not benefit the common man at all, whether it was the port rebuilding, renewing in Colombo or Hambantota. It didn't do that at all. Now, unfortunately, due to COVID, the limited foreign exchange earnings, which was the major foreign exchange earnings for Sri Lanka, they had come down during the civil war, were also totally destroyed, because nobody would during COVID traveling from any place to any place. So this compounded the problems that Sri Lanka had to repay heavily on the debts it had taken from China. It had to repay very heavily on sovereign debt bonds, which earlier had accumulated. And unfortunately, it had taken a decision against all sane economic advice that it would not take any relief from IMF, because IMF would impose conditionalities. It would have to take certain measures which would hurt the common man. And of course, due to fulfill their electoral promises, the Rajapaksas have recklessly promised tax cuts, etc. So they had no tax revenue. They adopted some means, some harebrained schemes like going in for organic farming without adequate preparation. When the crops failed, they did not have foreign exchange to buy chemical fertilizers. They did not have foreign exchange to buy fuel. There were large power cuts. The factories couldn't work. Who would visit Sri Lanka as a tourist under these circumstances, where there were movements, processions, agitations in the state capital? You did not know what would be the state of law and order where you were staying. Long power cuts. The Sri Lankan government didn't have enough money to buy paper and ink to print question papers, and examinations were postponed. Daily wages were not being paid. The inflation was running high, and all this was problematic. But very late, the Rajapaksa government decided finally to go to IMF. But before IMF relief could come, the people's patience broke down, and they came out on the street protesting, and a political crisis brewed. Gota Rajapaksa, who was the president, somehow persuaded, or his elder brother, who was the former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, to resign. In the interest of peace and tranquility, said the elder Rajapaksa. But that was too little too late, both going to the IMF and resignation of Mahinda Rajapaksa. Their other family members had been eased out of the cabinet earlier. Gota Rajapaksa had made an offer that the opposition party should come and form a government of national unity to tide over the economic crisis, but no opposition party was willing to give them this respite and this loophole to escape. They had landed the country in this mess. They should carry the can. Why should anybody else give them an opportunity and become a scapegoat for tiding over an interim government? So this was the state of affairs. Now, what happened is that when the people's patience broke and they came out on the streets, they encircled the Parliament House, they encircled the official residence of the Rajapaksa, they also encircled the private residence of the Rajapaksa. Now, this was considered provocative. and supporters of the Rajapaksa government came out to fight with the agitators. Now, the agitators were peaceful protesters. For weeks, if not months, they had been living under tents, camps, holding posters, protesting peacefully. They were exposed to tear gas, they were exposed to water cannons, they were exposed to rubber bullets, they were exposed to lathi charge, and all this resulted in a frayed tempers. And when the supporters of the Rajapaksa government came out to fight with these peaceful demonstrators, in the clashes, 7 innocent lives were lost. Unfortunately, the Rajapaksas tried to again communalize the conflict by bringing out the Buddhist clergy, some members of Buddhist monks, to fight in their support. And one Buddhist monk dressed in ochre was also wounded and carried out from the battlefield. Now, this was the last straw, as they say on the back of the camel. The agitators pushed the cars and trucks and buses owned by the ruling party into a tank, into a pond. They set fire to their properties. Private property was damaged. Now, this gave an excuse to the president to say that earlier he had imposed an emergency, withdrawn an emergency, imposed a curfew, withdrawn a curfew. He suddenly decided again that the best thing would be to reimpose emergency, reimpose curfew, and the Rajapaksa family now is taking shelter in a naval base in Trincomalee. So they have literally escaped the wrath of the people who are totally baying for their blood. He has not yet resigned. Only the Prime Minister has resigned. But the President and his family have been forced to flee from their official residences, their private residences, to a naval base where they feel more protected. Now, this is unfortunately very sad, because they had come back with a very decisive mandate when they returned to power. But what they did was they changed the constitution after that. They made it an executive presidency. They kept it within the family. There was nepotism, there was corruption, there was autocracy, there was curtailment of civil rights, and so on. Now, unfortunately, this has come at a worse time, because as the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa had said once, that if this continues, this political unrest continues, nobody in the world would consider Sri Lanka a place safe for investment or to give it a loan. So, to buy time, to have some respite, it is necessary to have political instability. But once again, we must, with all objectivity and respect for the existing government of Sri Lanka, state that this condition has been brought upon themselves on their own head. Now, if a government which was elected by a massive majority is forced within a couple of years to flee from office, to take shelter in a naval base, it says that it has lost the mandate of the people totally. And perhaps it would be best if the Rajapaksa family resigned gracefully, accepted that the people of Sri Lanka are no longer with them. And interestingly, right now, the Rajapaksa family, which was at one time supposed to be the savior by the Sinhala, now there is no Sinhala-Tamil divide in Sri Lanka at the moment. The economic crisis has united all the people, the Sinhalas, the Tamils, the Christians, the Muslims, and all of them want economy to improve, this sorry state of affairs to end, and the Rajapaksa family to go away. Now, this is easier said than done. This poses a great challenge for the Indian government. The Indian government has come out, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs has come out with a very balanced statement. It says the government of India is with the people of Sri Lanka. There is no mention of the government of Sri Lanka. And it makes a promise that the government of India will do all it can, all in its power, to relieve the misery of the Sri Lankan people. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done. How can India even dispatch humanitarian relief to Sri Lanka? How is it administered? How does it see it is not squandered when there is no visible government operating in Sri Lanka? Colombo is being under the charge of the army, with shoot at sight orders given to them by a president hiding in a naval base. Very great risk of abuse of civil liberties and fundamental rights of the Sri Lankan people. How long will it be when the officers and the men of police and army continue to obey, which apparently are patently unconstitutional, illegal orders of a government which has lost its all support? So once this happens, will there be a period of further anarchy, instability, or there would be a consensus among the opposition parties to behave more sensibly, accept tightening of the belt, accept aid and conditionalities of the IMF relief, accept aid coming from friendly countries like India, be watchful and wary about debt trap which they have got into thanks to the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative. But all that will take time. And when this takes time, this particularly sensitive region next door to India would remain very unstable and would create some kind of a concern, grave concern in India. We wish Sri Lankans well, but it's difficult to imagine stability returning there in a hurry. A time to turn westward again. In local bodies elections in United Kingdom, the Conservative Party has suffered a shocking, stunning defeat. They have lost their citadels in England itself, which they had not lost for past 40, 50 years. They have lost it to Labour. But what is even worse, they have lost the support of the people in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And the Northern Ireland has been the most shocking for most people in the United Kingdom. They were expecting that the Conservative Party would lose ground, but nobody had expected that the majority would be won by Sinn Féin. Now, Sinn Féin is the group, the political wing of the Irish Republican Army, which was a dreaded terrorist organization when the bloodbaths were taking place between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Now, all that is a thing of past. Lord Louis Mountbatten had been killed by an IRA attack. The IRA bomb blast had become terribly feared incidents in that part of the world for decades. But then now it seems that the Northern Ireland and under Sinn Féin and Irish Republic would like to unify it again, despite a very horrible past which they have had of communal disharmony, communal discord, religious strife. The years since past have shown them that probably people still would like to live together. And this has something to do with Brexit. Now, in Brexit, Britain had promised that they would have an Irish backstop on the sea, which has not worked out very well. It's not worked out very well for a variety of reasons, because there were apprehensions that it will be abused. It will be abused against the interests of the British. But more important than that, in a hurry to deliver Brexit, Boris Johnson did not think through what the problems would be. And Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, has been trying to live from one crisis to another, survive from one scandal to another, misleading Her Majesty the Queen, being economical with truth with the Parliament. He is party gating. He's been fined by the Metropolitan Police. Now, all these things have piled up. But he's a lucky man. Whenever his chair seems to be at risk, another crisis takes place and he gets a small respite to survive. But this time, it seems to be building up where his party members would be very unhappy with his leadership and say that time for him to go, because they cannot go into another general election with this kind of a leadership, a messy leadership. Similarly, in Scotland, there has not been a clear majority for the separatist party who want to have Scottish independence. And of course, in the recent referendum, majority of people had expressed the view it was not a razor-thin referendum to stay on with UK, but situation has changed much since then. So again, the situation is that Boris Johnson is faced in the United Kingdom that his country may be reduced to Britain, not Great Britain. It would be reduced to living with, sooner rather than later, without Northern Ireland and without Scotland. This might not happen immediately, but the compromises which Britain may have to make to keep peace in Northern Ireland and to keep people of Scotland with them and not have this dissent for secessionism is going to have a price to pay by that. What would this mean in terms of a reassessment of Brexit and reassessment of the leader of Boris Johnson is interesting. Now, all this is interesting for India in a different context. India has always thought that post-Brexit, there is space being created for India to develop a relationship with United Kingdom, which would go back to the days of Anglophone Commonwealth days, when Britain was not a part of EU, and then India probably could to a certain extent replace the trade which Britain had with EU. But now in the new context, it would have to look again that whether it is worth investing, not in terms of money, but investing energy, time in the context of country which is itself on a verge, if not on disintegration, on a very easy, stressful relationship among constituent units, and a leadership which is again totally discredited. So this kind of thing has to be watched very carefully. So these elections were for local bodies, were distant, but the results have been very, very decisive. And they show a clear divide among the constituent units of United Kingdom, and within Britain, great distrust of the Conservative Party under the leadership of Boris Johnson. International analysts have been focusing their attention on China in recent weeks. The reasons for these are twofold. China has declared that its economy is growing at the rate of 4.5% or more, which is more than any other country hit by COVID trying to recover its economy. These figures, of course, are lower than expected for China, but still encouraging for the rest of the world because of the supply chain dependence on China. But interesting, even if you concede that these figures are authentic, China is facing another major problem. While the rest of the world has recovered from the COVID, China is facing another surge of a COVID, very bad infection in its major cities like in Beijing, in Wuhan, in Shanghai. And China has been following a very interesting zero COVID tolerance policy. Whenever a case of COVID is found, that area is locked out totally. People are living in a curfew-bound kind of a situation. They are provided for food and water and medicines at their doorstep, but they can't step out. Now, once this happens and the whole cities are locked out, cities like Beijing has not been locked out as yet, but Shanghai has been undergoing a lockout, massive lockout for weeks, so is Wuhan. Now, what happens to the economic activity in these? When these people can't get out of their houses, obviously they can't get out to the workshops, factories, places of work. When they can't get out there because you want to curtail the infection rate to zero and confine them to their house, what happens to the economic recovery? So the claims of economic recovery or steady progress of economy are open to serious questions. The other problem which China is facing is this. Besides this zero COVID tolerance policy, the Chinese economic recovery has been founded to a very large extent on its infrastructure development. Now, China has a very large market. So if the China itself is a very large market for houses, for buildings, for bridges, for roads, so these companies could, instead of, which were supposedly earn a profit from one belt, one road initiative elsewhere in other countries, they could probably be supported by the government and the Chinese banks supported by the government to undertake these activities. But this again has been curtailed in recent past for two odd reasons. A, Xi Jinping himself has repeatedly said that prosperity has to be shared, there has to be social responsibility. So which means that the wings of these high-flying infrastructural companies have been clipped to a certain extent. The companies, the Chinese billionaires like Jack Ma of Alibaba have been asked to lie low for a moment. But what happens is that if these companies are not allowed to prosper like they were allowed to prosper in past, they will also retard the rate of Chinese economic growth. The other concerns have been about quality. The Chinese buildings have been collapsing. The buildings built at home have been collapsing. These charges had been made at Chinese companies in Egypt, in Cambodia, and elsewhere. But the quality of construction being below par seems to be directly tied to corruption. Corruption and compromising in quality to meet targets which the government imposes on them. That's one part. The most tricky part of this whole debate is this is the year when the party congress will meet and give Xi Jinping another term of 5 years in power. Nothing should go wrong between now and then to bring down either the Chinese economic growth or the control of Wuhan. Now, of course, the WHO has said that the zero COVID strategy is not sensible. The rest of the world is opening, the Chinese will have to open. But if the Chinese insist on following a policy of zero COVID, it is going to maybe tide over somehow the crisis till the party Congress gives Xi Jinping another term and puts him in the pantheon of the all-time Chinese great leaders with Mao and Deng Xiaoping. But the problem would remain that if the recovery is not really genuine, then there will be a severe backlash when it comes to the people who already are confined in lockdown-like situation in Wuhan and Shanghai are bristling with anger, and the children cannot be educated, the elderly cannot be looked after at home, top medical care cannot come to the doorstep. And what happens to Chinese showpieces like the Asian Games it was supposed to host? If everything is postponed, it would be an admission of the fact that the zero COVID control activity is not quite succeeding. This is something which India should not gloat over, because India's own economic recovery depends to a certain extent on intermediary pharmaceuticals coming from China, various auto parts which come from China, and even despite COVID, our trade with China has expanded. So despite our hostility with China along the northern Himalayan border, or the competition adversarial in the South China Sea and Indian Ocean, Asia Pacific region, we have a very interesting relationship with China in terms of economy. So our own economy might be impacted if Chinese economy takes a dip, or if the COVID takes a turn for the worse there. That is all we have for you this week. And as usual, we would like you to review all we have discussed with you at length, at your own leisure. Think about all the problems. Think about what all we have discussed. We have discussed India and Europe. We have not tried to confine ourselves to Prime Minister Modi's visit to 3 countries in 2 days. What we have tried to put before you is the whole perspective of very fast changing strategic situation in the Nordic Europe, North Europe, where Finlandization may end, where Finland and Sweden may become a member of the NATO, and what implications it would have on Indo-Russian and Russian-European relationship. We also have tried to say that these countries are important not only in the context of strategic sensitivity, but in context of climate change, in context of green energy, in context of scientific exploration and the blue economy under the seabed, and whatever is happening in the Arctic region. At the same time, when we talk of Europe, we are not talking only of European Union, we are talking of Germany, we are talking of France, and we are talking of different strokes for different folks. We have different interests which coincide with Germany, and a different set of interests which coincide with France. So can we manage to balance them and also keep them within the broad parameter perspective of the European Union? European Union is not without its stresses and strains, but that doesn't concern India as much as it concerns India's interest in the whole European region and the major powers which comprise the leadership of the European Union. We also have to worry about our immediate neighborhood. Whatever is happening in Sri Lanka is going to cause concern for us. We have to, as usual, keep our distance, keep our sympathies with the people of Sri Lanka, but not be partisan, not appear partisan with one government or the opposition. This is a difficult task, but Indian government seems to be managing it very well so far. Then we go back to the elections for local bodies in Britain, and we see some dramatic developments in Northern Ireland, similar developments in Scotland, and how they are going to impact on domestic politics of Great Britain or United Kingdom, and how they will impact on India's relationship with United Kingdom and its constituent units. We also have to have a look at what is happening next door in China. Is it recovering sufficiently? Is the claims to recovery genuine? Or what kind of obstacles remain in way? So kindly consider these things. Keep watching in dispassionate manner whatever you come across on the television, on the net, or in the print media, and make up your own mind logically as usual. Till we meet again, thank you and goodbye.